As most of you know, especially those that have been in our Bethel class, you know that these individuals and groups and writings are not discussed in detail in the New Testament, and yet all of them contribute to the thought and the theology that existed in the time of Jesus. And for that reason, it's important. All of these have come from the history within the 400 years between the Testaments, and I think are worthy of some discussion. I put this presentation together a number of years ago after teaching Bethel a few times in an attempt to sort of fill in the historical gaps that Harley Swigum doesn't attempt and address in that study. These are some of the references that I've used over the years, and so nothing I say will be made up by me. It's all that I've taken from these references, and if there's a huge mistake, it's because I've misinterpreted something that I've read, but it's just my purpose to try to convey to you in a succinct way the actions that went on in this period of time. Between the Testaments, the study we'll be doing for 2 weeks now is a brief look at the 400 silent years following the return of the Israelites from captivity in Babylon and the restoration of the temple in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Today, whoops, that didn't work. Today we'll examine the historical record from Alexander the Great through to the Roman Empire and the impact of that period on Israel as it dealt with the invasions and the influence of major world powers and fought to maintain its identity and independence. We will see development of Jewish governance through the Maccabean revolt and the dynamics of the Hasmonean dynasty. And 2 weeks from now, on the 25th, our second session, we will look at the emergence of Jewish sects that were so prominent in the time of Jesus and literature of that period that reveals change in the Jewish theological perspective that emerged during this period of time as the Jewish community navigated through periods of independence, prosperity, and domination. You don't need to memorize all these, but it's just a quick glance at things that happened in that 400 years that are significant. And they're all related in some way or another to the history of Israel, but not addressed specifically or in detail in the New Testament scripture. So, for you Bethel scholars, this is where we left Israel in our Old Testament Bethel class, and what the Middle Eastern world looked like after Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BC. And in 538, when Cyrus issued this edict, his edict to free Jews in captivity and allow them to return to Jerusalem. By 525, Persia had conquered even Egypt and dominated the world around Israel, as you can see here on the map. In 515, to put things in perspective, the Jewish temple was completed after 22 years of work, and Ezra and Nehemiah had begun to reshape the remnant community back into a into a Jewish nation. Here's what the reconstituted Israel looked like in 538 BC. Gerrymandering had taken place under Cyrus the Great, who renamed parts of Judah and Samaria as the Persian province of Yehud under a Judahite governor, and it remained as such until changed by Alexander the Great in 332. The boundaries of the Persian territory Yehud were considerably smaller than the previous combined Jewish northern and southern kingdoms. And interestingly, from the word Yehud comes the word Yehudi, which is the name given to the inhabitants of this new designated territory, and is the origin of the term Jew. The Persian Empire, following Cyrus, began to decline after the death of Darius I in 486 and entered a period of serious decline after Xerxes' failed invasion of Greece in about 480 BC. Heavy taxation, rebellion of captured nations caused continual erosion. Meanwhile, in Greece, Philip II of Macedonia had consolidated all of Hellas under his rule by 338. In 336, Philip was murdered and was succeeded by his son Alexander. Alexander rapidly defeats Persian forces in Asia Minor, then protects his southern flank by marching through Syria and Palestine to conquer Egypt, which had been returned, as we mentioned, to Persia. On the way, Alexander laid a significant and interesting 7-month siege at the island city of Tyre, defeating the fortified island city stronghold by building a bridge to the island. Let's see, I didn't show it there. So he built this bridge to be able to access this fortification. And after he had taken it, he crucified 2,000 men on the beach and took 30,000 men into slavery. So that characterizes the nature of Alexander's conquest, if you will. Judah and Samaria apparently did not resist, although Samaria later rebelled and was destroyed. Alexander then moves across Mesopotamia, defeats Darius at Gaugamela, and enters Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. And with no more active resistance, he moves to the eastern limits of the empire until his troops refused to go any further. Legend says he wept because there was no more worlds to conquer. He fell sick and died in Babylon in 323 at the age of 33. Busy young man. Alexander's son, born after his death, was killed by one of his generals. Cassander, who along with 3 other generals vied for the empire. Cassander controlled Macedon, Lysimachus in the Thrace, Antigonus in Asia, and Ptolemy in Egypt and southern Syria. Antigonus wanted it all, so the others ganged up on him. Ptolemy and his general Seleucus defeated Antigonus in Syria, and when the dust had settled, Antigonus was driven out of Asia, and Seleucus established himself in Babylon and northern Syria. So we're left essentially with, in the Palestine area, 2 powers that were generals of Alexander, Seleucus and Ptolemy. Ptolemy brought many Jews to Egypt in about 312 following his campaigns in Palestine. A large population settled in Alexandria and grew to be a center of Jewish culture with a population of over 1 million by the 1st century. It's here that the Hebrew Bible was translated into the Greek, called the Septuagint, and we'll talk a little more specifically about that next week in about 250 BC. Very little detail is known about what happened specifically in Judah and Samaria during Ptolemaic rule However, minimal duress seemed to have been applied, and the Jewish culture was allowed to continue to function autonomously. Palestine continued under the rule of the Ptolemies for the entire 3rd century. And you can see from the map, they're sort of on the, Israel's right here in between the two new kingdoms, if you will. The Seleucid kingdom had lost territory during the 3rd century, but when Antiochus III, or called also Antiochus the Great, came to power, he reestablished borders and was able to gain control of Palestine, land he believed the Ptolemies had stolen. The rule of the Ptolemies had been tolerant, but now, in about 198 BC, the Seleucids were determined to force the Jews to accept Hellenism. Antiochus was assisted with this by a surprisingly, by a sizable number of Jews who were impressed with the possibility of greater conformity and welcomed him, and in return were granted tax relief and temple funding. Antiochus the Great, however, extended himself, encouraged by Hannibal. Hannibal, where did he come from? He's the guy with the elephants, right? Okay, but he was there at this particular time, and I may go into that later, but encouraged by Hannibal, he attempted to take Greece, but was quickly driven from Greece in Asia Minor and was forced to sue, so you don't have it, yeah, the red arrows, sue for peace. He paid enormous indemnity, surrendered his war elephants, navy, refugees, including Hannibal, and 20 hostages, a significant one being one of his sons, Antiochus IV. Antiochus the Great was succeeded by his son Seleucus IV, who confirmed the privileges granted Israel by his father, but began to take temple funds with the help of certain Jews. Seleucus was assassinated and succeeded by Antiochus IV, his brother, who was on his way home from 10 years as a hostage in Rome. So, Antiochus IV is now the ruler. He called himself Epiphanes, which means light of the world or God on earth, but he was anything else to the Jews. By then, he was called by the Jews Epimanes, which is a play on words meaning madman or goon on earth. So he wasn't well thought of. Antiochus IV was not kind to conservative Jews. He tightened his hold with systematic Hellenization by edict and became evil incarnate to Orthodox Jews. He was assisted by Jason, a Jew, who paid Antiochus to be the high priest and replace his brother, Jason's brother, Onias III, who was the current conservative high priest. Some of the initiatives of Antiochus included his equating Jupiter to Israel's God, pagan deity image in the temple. That was a statue of him, of course. Heathen rites in the temple, sacrifice of swine on the temple altar. At one point, a scribe was flogged to death for refusing to eat a sacrificed pig. Bacchus, the god of wine, was worshipped, and the worship there was really an orgy, and that was compulsory. Circumcision was forbidden. Women who were killed who circumcised their children, and Sabbath, true worship, was forbidden, and the scriptures were destroyed. So not a good time for conservative Jews under Antiochus IV. Okay. Oppression of the Jews by Antiochus produces kind of an unexpected reaction that surprised Antiochus and many of the Jews. Emissaries of Antiochus erected a pagan altar at Modin and asked the Jews to show loyalty by offering sacrifices there. Mattathias, an old priest, was asked to set an example, and when he refused, another Jew took his place. Matthias killed that apostate Jew and the emissary that Antiochus had sent with him. So, with his 5 sons, Mattathias destroyed the heathen altar and fled to the hills and was joined by other Jews, which led to the Maccabean revolt. So soon after this revolt, Mattathias died, and he had urged his followers to allow his son Judas, his 3rd son, known as the Maccabee, which translates to hammer, to take over leadership. Judas continued to win victories in guerrilla warfare, and many more Jews rallied to his banner. Several factors contributed to this success. And you think, how can a small group of Jews have success against Antiochus? So initially, the Syrians didn't take him seriously. Even after Antiochus realized that there was a real threat there, he couldn't devote his full force because to him there was a more serious threat facing him from Parthian, just to the east. This gave Judas a great victory at Emmaus and allowed him to take Jerusalem. The temple was reclaimed in an event celebrated ever since as Hanukkah. So, Hanukkah, also known as the Festival of Lights, is an 8-day Jewish holiday commemorating the rededication of the Holy Temple at this particular time. Hanukkah is observed for 8 nights from late November to December in the Gregorian calendar. The festival is observed by the kindling of the lights of a special candelabrum, the 9-branched menorah, or Henekiah, 1 light on each night of the holiday, progressing to 8 on the final night. And an extra light called Shamash is also lit each night for the purpose of lighting the others, and is given a distinct location, usually above or below the rest. According to the Talmud, at the rededication following the victory of the Maccabees over the Seleucid Empire, there was only enough consecrated olive oil to fuel the eternal flame in the temple for 1 day. Miraculously, the oil burned for 8 days, which was the length of time it took to press and prepare fresh olive oil. All of the accounts, I should have had that up before. All of the accounts speak to Jews who preferred to die rather than submit to Antiochus' decree. The 2nd book of Maccabees in particular has many such accounts. One tells of Eleazar, a scribe in his 90s, who refused to eat pork and died by torture. The most famous is that of Hannah and her 7 sons. Each son is asked by the king to eat pork, or some version of it, and each refuses. After proclaiming his faith in God, each is horribly put to death. Even the 7th and youngest refuses, and both he and Hannah die. So you can see the source, the origin of the significance of Hanukkah and the retaking of the temple by Judas. So, from the Maccabees, we move into the Hasmonean dynasty. What does that mean? The Hasmonean dynasty followed, and according to historian Josephus, Hasmonean comes from a Maccabee ancestor named Asmoneus. At the death of Simon, the last son, living son of Mattathias, John Hyrcanus took over leadership, but only with the permission of the strong Syrian neighbor to the north, and was required to give up some coastal cities that they'd conquered, and with the exception of Jaffa. The Syrian king left Palestine alone, and Israel returned to the influence of the Hasidim, which was the conservative element of the Jewish community that had supported the Maccabean revolt and was associated with the group that became known as the Pharisees. Okay, now Hyrcanus continued with Jewish expansion, particularly in Idumea, where those conquered were, and this is kind of ironic, in that they were required to be circumcised and accept Judaism. And what were the Jews fighting? They were fighting a religious battle as well, but now they forced that on the folks from the old Edom, Idumea. So as conservative as Hyrcanus was, his sons had been raised in privilege, and at his death, Aristobulus assumed power after killing 3 of his brothers. He associated with the Hellenistic Sadducees and expanded the country to the north. But in a year's time died of drinking disease. His only survivor was Alexander Jannaeus, who took over and continued this aggressive expansion, extending Israel's border to the size of it was at the time of David and Solomon. Wow. He severely alienated the Pharisees and crucified over 800 in the presence of guests. Tradition suggests that Jannaeus repented on his deathbed and instructed his wife, Salome Alexandra, to dismiss Sadducees and reign with the aid of Pharisees. So you can see how far back this conflict between the Sadducees and the Pharisees are. They took turns supporting the current ruler and were at odds with one another, in many cases to the death. Alexandria had been married successively to Aristobulus and Alexander Jannaeus, and with the assistance from the Pharisees, had a relatively peaceful reign. So in spite of Alexander Jannaeus saying, being supported by the Sadducees in his deathbed, he tells his wife, you really need the Pharisees on your side. And so she did that, and that helped her to have a relatively peaceful reign. At her death, Hyrcanus was made king, but the tension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees remained, with the Sadducees supporting Aristobulus, which led to Hyrcanus actually wasn't much of a fighter, so he submitted and said, okay, you got it. I'm not going to fight you. And now Aristobulus has become both the king and the high priest with the support of the Sadducees. And if I mention it, the S's and the P's are the Sadducees and Pharisees supporting the various Hasmonean rulers over time. So we think back to the map of Yehud, which wasn't even as big as the northern and southern kingdoms when we started all of this after Cyrus had allowed the Jews to come back. And now, through this period of time of Maccabees and Hasmonean rulers, this is the extent of the growth. You can see it goes from light to dark red to purple, and the last being essentially Alexander Jannaeus. And you can see the Dead Sea and Sea of Galilee, how far that reaches and covers all the coast area and so forth. So it's a very significant extent to which the Hasmonean expansion extended. At its peak, as I mentioned, the Hasmonean Israel had regained territory the size of David and Solomon's kingdom.
And what's a little
There, that was an area that they weren't allowed to reclaim, if you will. And this is in the, well, this is the whole period, 168 to 63. So for that whole period, they didn't have all of the coastline. They were prevented from that. So one of the interesting sidelights about this area, this time period, particularly Alexander Jannaeus, who was king at the height of expansion. Coins that were used for commerce during this period they weren't Roman. They were minted by the Judean king. In this case was Jannaeus. And we all know about the widow's mite, or pruta. We're familiar with scripture from that. And it was produced by Jannaeus in great quantity. A mite was worth not much. You know, you can find different answers if you Google it, but a reasonable one is 1/128th of a denarius, denarius being roughly a day's wage. Remember from the sermon this morning, the Good Samaritan paid 2 denarii, would be 2 days' wages. So this pruta was worth 1/128th of a denarius, or some folks say about 1/8 of our penny, of a cent. So it wasn't worth much, which helps understand that story. The coin was struck from, you can see the two sides of it there, from bronze with a Macedonian 8-pointed star on one side and the Phoenician inverted anchor on the reverse. Between the rays of the 8-pointed star are tiny ancient Hebrew letters spelling Yehonatan, which I think translates to Jannaeus, the Hebrew name of the king. So I've got a mite here. This is a pruta. I got this years ago for my wife, for Sue, and this is how big it is. I mean, this is supposedly a coin, actual coin. You know, you got the paper with it and all that sort of stuff. But if you read, there are so many of these made that it isn't like they're collectors, a huge collector's item, although they're going up slightly in value over time. So in 63 BC, Pompey, Roman, intervened in the power struggle between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Remember, they were at odds. Hyrcanus had initially been made king by his mother, and then Aristobulus took over, and there was a constant tension going on between the two. So Pompey, the Roman, now intervened in that tension and that argument, if you will, about who's in charge. And at the urging of Antipater, who is Herod's father, and there's a story to this that I'll hopefully make clear here in a minute, Antipater sided with Hyrcanus because the argument he made to Pompey was if Aristobulus was made king, he's planning a revolt against Rome. And oh, by the way, Hyrcanus would be better able to pay the bribe for Roman support. So Pompey embraced Hyrcanus. Jerusalem was besieged for 3 months, breached with 12,000 Jews slaughtered in the battle. So another bloody takeover, if you will. And this is, even though they had presence, this is the first time the Roman influence had really taken hold in there. So in 47 BC, Hyrcanus II was made king by Julius Caesar. And although Antipater, Herod's father, really held the power, Hyrcanus was the figurehead and the Jewish king, if you will. In 40 BC, Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus II, and the last Hasmonean, having allied himself with the Parthians. Remember, before Antiochus was intimidated by the Parthians, and that allowed the Maccabees to succeed. So the Parthians are still over there as a big threat even to Rome. And so Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus, allied himself with the Parthians, and he succeeded then of taking control of Jerusalem. Hyrcanus II, who Pompey had made Julius Caesar had made king, and Phasael, who was Herod's brother, are taken prisoners. But Herod flees to Masada and then later to Rome. Phasael actually killed himself, and Antigonus disfigured his uncle Hyrcanus so he couldn't be the priest. And so there's a lot of dynamics going on at this point. In the meantime, Herod fled from Masada to Rome, and in 40 BC, he did some serious lobbying in Rome, and by 40 BCE, he came to Rome, gaining the confidence of Antonius and Octavian. The Roman Senate granted Herod the title of King of the Jews. And in 37 BC, he marched to Jerusalem with Rome's help and drove out the Parthians who had supported Antigonus in his takeover of Jerusalem. I know that's a little complicated, but a lot of dynamics going on here. And finally, Rome stepped in and said, okay, we got it. Here's the way it's gonna set out. So Herod becomes king of the Jews. So who was Herod? I mean, why did he have that leverage, and why did he think he had some right to become the king? He was the second son of Antipater. Remember, we talked about him. He was an official, Idumean official, in Hyrcanus's cabinet, if you will. So he had influence, but he was an Edomite. So he had been the high-ranking official under Hyrcanus II, and he was also the son of Cypros, a Nabatean Arab princess from Petra. Anybody been to Petra? Yeah. Neat place. In present-day Jordan. So Herod's father was by descent an Edomite. His ancestors had converted to Judaism. Remember, Hyrcanus conquered Idumea and required the Idumeans to convert. So that's where the Jewish influence in Herod's family came, because his father had converted to Judaism. So Herod was very familiar with the Jewish culture and had been raised in that sense. So Herod was raised as a Jew. So, in parallel with the Hasmonean period, and following the Punic Wars in 146 BC, Rome was in control of the Western Mediterranean, and shortly thereafter, rule was extended over Macedonia, Corinth, and all of Achaia, and in 133, the king of Pergamum, Western Turkey, Pergamum, gifted his territory in Asia to the Romans. So the Romans now really have a huge foothold. So what does that mean for Herod? He'd been granted king of the Jews, to be king of the Jews, and what did that give him control over? So Herod ruled all the territory in the black outline there, from 37 BC until he died at 4 BC. And Herod was a client king ruling on behalf of the Romans, who had invaded, of course, in 63. He began the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. Remember, it was quite elaborate in this rebuilding of the temple, and went on to be one of the wonders of the world. When Herod died, his kingdom was divided among his surviving sons. Herod Antipas, Herod Antipas, who has Galilee and Perea, those portions. Herod Philip, up in the Syrian region, and Archelaus, who had the meat and potatoes of the Jewish kingdom, if you will, the old northern and southern kingdoms, and Jerusalem, and all that significant parts of Jewish territory. But in 6 Common Era, very, very soon after this transfer had taken place, which is about 4 BC when Herod died, the Roman Emperor, exiled Archelaus to Gaul. Wow, where's that? That's a long ways away, in Spain, because of his incompetence. So now, what happens now? Who's in charge? So this is the Palestine in which Jesus lived. Note that Judea and Samaria, that had been given to Herod's son Archelaus, was controlled by a Roman governor or procurator. And in this case, at the time, not right away, but later on, and toward the end of Jesus' life, that governor was Pilate. So he was a Roman official who ruled Jerusalem and the whole area that we're looking at there. So that's how Pilate gets in there, being the contemporary of the Herod brothers, if you will, but still being a Roman. Also note that Herod Antipas, ruled in the Galilee area, which accounts for the relationship between Pilate and Herod at the Jesus trial and execution. Remember how those dynamics that are going on at the trial? We got Pilate saying, "Well, I got to talk to Herod," and who are those guys? These are the guys. And finally, just in the interest of note, because it's mentioned in the New Testament, Decapolis, a league of 10 cities, which sort of a loose configuration, which had been established by all the way back to when Pompey first took control in 63, a region in which we see Jesus appearing during his ministry, because it's not far when he's running around the Sea of Galilee, not far over to the Decapolis to do some ministry and work over there, and that's a blow up of the 10 leagued cities, if you will.
Who ruled the 10 cities? Were they under Roman rule?
They were independent, basically, but they were allowed to be there because that was the edict that Pompey gave them when he created that area and said, okay, this doesn't belong to anybody, these guys can rule themselves. And they had, as I understand it, kind of a loose confederation. They weren't a nation, they didn't collaborate that closely, but they allowed free commerce and activities between them. So in relationship to what's going on in the New Testament that we all are relatively familiar with, who's in charge? Well, here's a list of the major positions: the emperor, the procurator, or the governor of Judah and Samaria, the king, that would be the Galilean area. Herod, of course, had it originally. Archelaus was the first governor in the south, but he got deported. And so all the folks on the left there are who were in charge in Jerusalem and the southern kingdom. And Herod Antipas, of course, was the one in charge for the majority of and this is the life of Jesus, where it spans his birth at the end of Herod the Great's life, and then his crucifixion, where we see Pontius Pilate as a major player, Herod Antipas still there to be part of that story. And in the terms of the high priest, Caiaphas, in the time period of the crucifixion that we're familiar with. Confusing? Can you repeat all that back to me? Any?
So when Pilate decided to send the problem to Herod, it was because Jesus was considered a Galilean.
Yeah.
And Herod was the ruler of Galilee.
Yes. I mean, that's a reason, but I think there was maybe more to it than that. I'm going to wash my hands of all this and so forth. But that's why they were both involved in the crucifixion story and the judging. Does this raise any questions that I may or may not be able to answer? So I think, a major point to me is that we read of what we do know in the New Testament is the Sadducees and the Pharisees didn't get along very well. Is it a little clearer now why they didn't? They were at odds, physically battling one another because of their support for one ruler or another. And that tension and that transfer of power went back and forth, particularly through the Hasmonean area, to say who's in charge. And so by the time Jesus came around, that animosity that had grown for over 100 years was still surfacing, and it was still there. And the philosophical difference, of course, was that the Sadducees were accepting of the Hellenization, of the changes of their captors, if you will, and the Pharisees were more related to the original conservative Jews of the Hasidim that supported the Maccabean revolt. So that's, I think, probably one of the major takeaways in terms of what's the rest of the story when we're reading through the New Testament, and sort of how did we get here, and how did people feel about things. Okay, so 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about less about history and a little bit more about theology, if you will. We'll talk in more depth about the Jewish sects, and it's not just the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but the Essenes and others that played a role, that some of which surface in the New Testament. And then we'll look at period literature. We mentioned today the Septuagint, the Jewish version of the old, or the Greek version of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Old Testament, that was translated in about 250 BC in Alexandria. We'll read a little bit about the story and the legend behind all of that. We'll talk about the Apocrypha, and some of that we've alluded to in the Maccabees, which is part of that describes in a great amount of detail the conflict and the dynamics that were going on during the Maccabean revolt. But there are other books that are associated with that, and they reveal a thought process and a theology, if you will, that changes the Jewish thought process a little bit. We'll talk about pseudepigrapha, which is literature that surfaced in about the same time that we're talking about, the 2nd century or so BC, and it was a series of books that were written as if they were originally written by Enoch or somebody way back in the Old Testament, and in some cases it attempts to fill in the gaps of the Old Testament of Genesis, for example. It has additional stories about what really happened there, and the whole sense of that was the theology of the Old Testament was basically, we do good and we're rewarded. We do bad and we're punished. Life's easy. Life's simple. And they get to Antiochus IV, who's sacrificing pigs in the temple, and they get killed for that. And they're saying, wait a minute, what's wrong with this story? We're doing everything as best we can. We're doing it right, we think, by the scriptures, and all these bad things are happening. What's going on here? And so it required a theological change, if you will, or I would call it evolution or maturity, to say, what about evil? Well, there's a guy in the Old Testament referred to as Satan. Did he have a role in all this? And so the pseudepigrapha gives us some insight. None of it's scripture, but it gives you an insight into the thought process that was all going on in this couple of centuries before Christ. And so it changed the thought process of the Jewish community. We'll talk a little bit about apocalyptic literature that we immediately think of the book of Revelation, but there's Old Testament things in Daniel and other places, and we look at the role of that and its influence in thought processes. And then, as I mentioned, we'll talk about what I call theological evolution. It's just, where did all this talk in the New Testament come from about Satan, particularly in the way that he's described in the New Testament, and angels? What about resurrection? You know, that wasn't a big subject in the Old Testament. And what about heaven and hell? What's going on there? There's a lot more detail in the New Testament that we wonder where it comes from, and so we'll look at a little bit of the appearance of that thought process that looks at those issues. Okay, any other questions, Harry?
What happened to the million Jews that were living in Alexandria and their influence during this period?
Well, they remained a very influential part of the Jewish culture, and it was no longer only coming out of Jerusalem, but they maintained their presence and influence in that area. Anything else?
If Jesus hadn't come on the scene, What were the people's beliefs of life after death? If someone died back then, what did they think?
I'm glad you asked, because we'll talk about that. I don't want to get into it right now, because we'll be talking about that next time in terms of where did all that come from? Where did that change of the way people were considered after death in the Old Testament, and in the perspective that we have now of a heaven and a hell and so forth, and where does all that come from?
But today the Jewish still don't have that, right? We still believe.
Not in the way the Christian perspective, yeah. Okay. Thank you for staying awake. I don't see a hiss. Okay, we'll see you in 2 weeks.